Thank you very much, Mr. Milionis, for this introduction and for your support to this conference. It is a great pleasure and a great honor for me to have been invited by the Court to present a lecture on audit and art. Recently, in the context of the partnership between the University of Lorraine and the European Court of Auditors, I had the pleasure to supervise the master thesis of Mr. de la Fuente Garrigosa, who carried out a study entitled Art as a Management Tool in Public Organizations, the case of the European Court of Auditors, which I wholeheartedly recommend. In this study, Mr. de la Fuente Garrigosa describes in particular the ways in which works of art are present at the European Court of Auditors, whether in the members' offices or in public spaces. This study is a very good demonstration of the Court's strong attachment to art. Today, I'm truly flattered to be able to contribute to the continued presence of art at the European Court of Auditors through this lecture, which I have called The Audit Explosion in Contemporary Art. I have taken the expression audit explosion from Michael Power of the London Business School, who published a book in 1994 entitled The Audit Explosion. Here is a cover of the book. Michael Power used this particular expression to refer, and I quote, to the growing frequency of the word audit and the spread of audits of all kinds in society since the late 1980s. This audit explosion phenomenon can be observed today in contemporary art in at least two ways. The first is the spread of audits in the world of contemporary art, which is due both to the proliferation of contemporary art museums around the world and to the recent variety of internal and external audits carried out in museum organizations, including financial, performance, and art collection audits, among others. The second is the increased presence of audit in contemporary artworks themselves as a result of the artist's choice to refer to audit or even to use audit practices to create an artwork. It is this second phenomenon that I am going to speak about today. The aim of this lecture is therefore to demonstrate this audit explosion in contemporary artworks and also to offer a different perspective on audit by questioning what contemporary artworks reveal about it. You might wonder why contemporary art specifically. Why not including classical or modern art? There are three main reasons for my choice. First, because until the early 90s, I only found a small number of works of art whose subject, as defined by the artist, was audit. The majority of the works relating to audit that I have identified are portraits of auditors from courts of audit made over the centuries and found in many countries. I have selected three examples among many others. From left to right, the portrait of Jacques Tubeuf, president of the Chambre des Comptes, painted in 1663 by the French artist Pierre Mignard. In the middle, the portrait of François Leidecker, delegate to the Court of Audit for Zeeland, a province situated in the southwest of the Netherlands, made in 1690 by an unknown artist. This painting is now in the collection of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Lastly, the portrait of Baron Gustav Adolf Rotherholm, President of the Chamber of Audit and Supreme Chamberlain, from the collection of the Swedish National Museum of Fine Arts, and this portrait was made by the Swedish artist Anders Eklund in 1756. I think you will agree that such portraits reveal the social importance of auditors at the time the portrait was produced. But they provide little information on what the audit practices actually was at this period of time. At most, such portraits act as evidence of the importance attached to audit. The second reason why I will focus specifically on contemporary art is the fact that I found only one genre scene explicitly representing the auditor at work. It is a painting entitled The Audit, made in 1958 by the Ukrainian artist Mikhail Alexandrovich Kokin, who was born in 1921 and died in 2009. I suggest we linger a few minutes on this painting, which I find interesting because of what it reveals about audit at that time. According to me, this painting can be divided into two main parts. The right-hand part takes up about 70% of the composition. In this part, we can see an accounting officer seated behind his desk, an accounting ledger open before him. He is leaning away from the two men next to and opposite him, showing mistrust. The man in the black suit is leaning on the back of the chair facing the desk and is frowning at the accounting officer with suspicion. The other man, wearing a raincoat, showing that he does not work at that office, that he is from outside, is examining a document with a probing look. The second part, on the left side of the painting, shows other office staff. They are demonstrating curiosity and indiscretion. The man in the background is more interested in what is happening to his colleague than in the document he had come to read, possibly an excuse to get closer. In the foreground, a secretary seems to be whispering to a colleague about the scene unfolding in front of them, equally curious to know what is happening. According to me, two main ideas emerge from this painting, one from each of the two parts I just described. The first one is a suspicion of fraud, which we understand from the demeanor of the two auditors. The second is curiosity and the impact of the audit on the auditee's reputation. The characters on the left side of the painting also play the part of the auditor, but in the sense of someone who listens. In other words, their role is also an audit, but in the whole meaning of hearing or audience. Since I was not able to find the origin of the work, I cannot be sure that this painting is based on reality observed by the artist. Still, I think it is possible to argue that this painting reflects the spirit of an era in terms of what audit was at that time. If we agree on that, it allows to put in perspective what audit has become in today's society. Indeed, what this painting shows is a time when being audited was seen as a result of potential fraudulent actions and could result in disgrace, rather than a normal procedure for the purposes of transparency and improvement, as audit is today. Finally, a third reason why I will focus on contemporary art specifically is because since the early noughties, the reference to audit in contemporary artworks developed in four main forms. First of all, it is possible to find artworks in which the word audit appears, but which do not have any connection with audit. At most, they reveal the increasingly widespread use of the word audit in common parlance. For example, in this artwork by the American artist Gillian Whelan, entitled Audit the Fed, the artist refers to the Reserve Federal Transparency Act of 2015, also known as Audit the Fed. The artist took this expression and wrote it on a background made of banknotes, real and fake. However, according to me, this cannot be understood as a provocative message, the artist asking for auditing the Fed, because the Fed is already audited. It has to be apprehended more as an expression taken out of its context in order to create a contrast between the joyful aestheticism of the artwork and the seriousness of the topic. It is also possible to identify artworks whose title led us to interpret the work as an audit being carried out or as a result of an audit. For example, the work Corporeal Audit by British artist Matt Collishaw is a sculpture in negative relief depicting the deceased body of Christ based on a Renaissance sculpture. Her horizontal rod of light moving in a cold mechanical manner like an MRI is placed behind the work, traversing and illuminating its shallow image. As you understand, the title of this artwork refers to audit, but in a broader sense, that is, a general examination of something. References to audit in contemporary art can also be found in art exhibitions entitled Audit. The first such exhibition I identified was held in 2001 at Casino Luxembourg, which is, as most of you already know, a contemporary art forum at the heart of Luxembourg City. On the screen is the cover of the exhibition catalogue published following this exhibition. While this was not the first time that the question of an audit of the art world had arisen, as evidenced by the series of interviews by the German artist Joseph Beuys entitled The Joseph Beuys Lectures 1995, an Art Audit, which can be listened to on the website of the Tate Museum, to the best of my knowledge, this was the first time that an art audit was carried out on the basis of exhibited artworks. Since the exhibition at Casino Luxembourg, other exhibitions similarly entitled Audit have been held all over the world, for example at the Contemporary Art Center in Vilnius, Lithuania in 2012, or at the group exhibition Powerlong Art Center in Hangzhou in China in 2018. Finally, the fourth category is composed of artworks in which the artist intentionally refers to audit, understood both as the auditor at work and the result of that work. In contemporary art, this reference to audit is not only to search in the figurative dimension of the artwork, but also in the physicality of the work, as well as in the conceptual phase of the work, that is to say, in the concrete practice of the artist. Indeed, as you might know, these days, any object can become an art material, and any practice, from the simplest to the most complex, can become an artistic practice. Here are a few well-known contemporary artworks illustrating this idea. In the upper left corner is The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, an artwork conceived in 1989 by Damien Hirst and composed of a 13-foot tiger shark preserved in a tank of formaldehyde. Below is a banana taped to a wall by Maurizio Cattelan in 2019. In the middle is a bride, a chandelier made out of sanitary tampons, made by artist Joana Vasconcelos in 2001. And on the right, you can see New Shelton Wet Dry's triple-decker, composed of 3 vacuum cleaners made by Jeff Koons in 1981. The audit report and the practice of auditing are no exception to this conception of the world by art. In the remainder of this presentation, I am going to present 6 contemporary artworks which refers to the work of the auditor, distinguishing in turn the representation of the audit, its presence in the physicality of the work, and the use of auditing in the conceptual approach to the work. In each case, I will focus more specifically on what the artwork reveals of audit by examining the artist's intention in making audit the core of their work, and sometimes also what they are saying about audit through the way in which they involve, use, or even embody it. You may be surprised that a scholar in accounting and audit would take this approach. But I would argue that the interpretation of artistic and cultural works in which audit references are present may benefit from the viewpoint of an auditor, or professor in audit in my case, as well as that of an art critic. Let's start with the first category, the representation of the audit in the artwork. The audit can be represented figuratively, drawing inspiration from reality, or in abstract terms, aiming to represent what we know rather than what we see. I will start with an abstract work by the Greek artist TOLIS KONSTANTINOS entitled Audit Scenario, created in 2017. I will leave it up to each of you to interpret this abstract painting as you wish, based on your own experience as an auditor or as an auditee maybe. Personally, I like to interpret it as meaning that the audit scenario followed determines the nature of the outcome. Such a reading would thus call into question the idea of the audit having any kind of objectivity. The second artwork I would like to present is L'Audit, one of the most emblematic works by the French well-known artist Martin Le Chevalier. In 2008, in order to ascertain the relevance of his work and measure its chances of success, Martin Le Chevalier asked a consulting firm to carry out an artistic performance audit with him as the subject of the audit. Martin Le Chevalier first exhibited the audit report, which took the form of slides at the Biennale de Rennes in France in 2008. The report, without any modifications of any kind from the artist, became the artwork. Here are 4 slides from this exhibited report. Here again, I will leave it up to each of you to enjoy its content as well as its aesthetic dimension, and to question the role of colors and graphs in the convincing aspect of an audit report. Then, from September to October 2008, Martin Le Chevalier created an installation based on this audit experience at the Maisonneuve Gallery in Paris, consisting of a sound installation lasting 18 minutes and 34 seconds, corresponding to a reading of the audit report as it may have been read to the artist by those who produced it, and a photograph, the one I am showing right now. As you can see, in the corner of a large empty room with grey walls, lit by the light from high wide windows with panels of opaque glass, suggesting the premises of an abandoned factory, a man, his back turned, works at a laptop placed on a makeshift table consisting of a board and 2 trestle legs. Behind him is a man standing up, his head slightly tilted down. Wearing a dark suit and holding a briefcase in his hand, characteristic of a consultant, he seems to be watching the man working. The sitting man does not seem to have noticed that the other man is there, or, if he has, he does not seem to be disturbed by this in any way. Looking at the title of the work and the words played through the speakers, one interpretation of this photograph could be that it is the artist's work that is being observed by the man standing, who we might imagine to be an auditor. Audit is thus presented as a discrete task observation process, which must not disrupt the task observed in order to be able to grasp it in its reality. This artwork, I think, can be understood as a strong criticism of a contemporary vision of art as just another economic process that can be audited. From an audit standpoint, what I like is this photograph is its framing. It gives the viewer the impression of observing the audit as though they were also in the room, in the opposite corner of the 2 men. This reading is coherent with the idea that the viewer is also an auditor, in the sense of the person who listens the voiceover. If we accept this interpretation, the title of the work, L'Audit, also refers to the audit of the auditor's work, with the viewer becoming the auditor's auditor, without the auditor noticing its presence, or without the auditor paying attention to it. This sequence then becomes endless, as viewing the work, then looking at another person contemplating the work, continues the chain through the audit of the audit of the audit. If we agree with this reading, from an audit standpoint, this artwork questions the limitation of the relevance of the auditor's work and ask the viewer to question the results presented by monitoring the way in which the audit was carried out. In this second category, I am going to discuss two contemporary artworks with one thing in common. They both contain an audit report as a constituent part of the work. The first is a painting by the Luxembourgish artist Robert Brandy entitled Overcovering, created in 2009. Most of you are already familiar with this work, as it is displayed at the entrance to the K2 conference room at the European Court of Auditors. To my knowledge, this work was commissioned from the artist who, in order to produce it, used reports from the court as a medium. In this enlargement of the center of the painting, you can see an extract from a report that was intentionally left legible by the artist. We can read the text Cour des comptes européenne. Robert Brandy seems to have intentionally used the court's reports to infuse this painting with the spirit of the court. In other words, he did not seek to use them solely for aesthetic purposes. On the contrary, to the artist, these materials have retained their symbolic dimension. This work, which is essentially abstract, thus becomes the meeting point between an institution, the court, and art, and it offers the viewer numerous possible interpretations, such as, does this represent the court's buildings? Should audit be considered an art? Does this artwork denote the centrality of the court in a multifaceted environment? Here again, I will leave it to each of you to add your own interpretation to the list. The second artwork I have selected is entitled Compter mes jours, Counting My Days in English, and was created by the Québécois artist Julie Picard in 2017. On her website, which I highly recommend, Julie Picard presents herself as an artist accountant, as she is both a practicing accountant and an artist. For her, the work Compter mes jours was an attempt to explore the space between her artistic and accounting practices. To do so, she counted the number of days that had elapsed since her birth and entered the tally on a different sheet of paper for each day. Then she archived the papers by year in folders, which she placed in 5 storage boxes. This approach is part of the aesthetics of administration, to borrow the expression used by Benjamin Bachelot, to refer to artists who sort, categorize, archive, etc., in the manner of a bureaucratic system, an artistic practice that developed in the 1960s with conceptual art. To reinforce the impression of an accounting practice meeting the artistic practice, Julie Picard had her work protocol audited by an audit firm, and she included the audit report in her artwork as an accounting officer would have done for financial statements. From my viewpoint, by having her work audited, Julie Picard showcases the power of audit as a legitimating tool. The concrete presence of the report conveys a very convincing impression of trust and assurance. For me, it also reflects the dynamics of an audit society, to refer again to the title of a book published by Michael Power, this one in 1997. Let's now turn to the third category, when being audited or being an audit practitioner is an artistic practice. Here again, I will present the work of 2 artists, starting with the work Environmental Audit of Australian artist Lucas ILHEIN. Between September and December 2010, Lucas ILHEIN carried out an environmental audit at the request of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney as part of an exhibition entitled In the Balance, Art for a Changing World. This exhibition concerns itself with environmental destruction, global warming, climate change, and all this entails. ILHEIN was commissioned to undertake an audit of the exhibition's environmental impact. The audit was carried out over the 4-month run of the exhibition in the form of an artist residency within the gallery space. This audit was therefore both a view of the exhibition and a work in the exhibition. This audit was based on 2 questions. What are the ethical and environmental considerations that such an exhibition should itself consider? And what are the sustainability issues that such an exhibition may bring to the fore? But ILHEIN is not an auditor. He is an artist. He has no audit training. He therefore has only a basic knowledge, a common sense knowledge of what audit is. And he was not given any instructions on how to carry out the audit or any specific requirements regarding the form. He chose to produce a set of diagrams showing his thoughts and some analyses he made, which were displayed at the exhibition. Here, you can see a photo of his work as it was exhibited. In one diagram, he presented his analysis of the exhibition's electricity consumption. To this end, he drew a plan of the exhibition space, showing the various rooms and the artworks found there. He then counted the number of light bulbs and detailed the other sources of energy consumption, such as televisions, computers, and lifts. He then asked an engineer to measure the amount of energy consumed by each type of source in order to calculate the amount of carbon dioxide generated by the exhibition. In calculating the electricity consumption, he becomes aware of the impact of lighting on the functioning of the air conditioning, since lighting is a source of heat and could increase the energy consumption of air conditioners. But ultimately, he decides not to include this factor, accepting that an audit is always incomplete. What is interesting is that ILHEIN delivers only a result. He does not take a position or give an opinion. It is then up to the visitor to ask him or herself the question of whether the negative environmental impact of the show outweighs its cultural benefits. In other words, was it worth it? More broadly, this artwork questions whether the environmental impact of any art exhibition is worth the conceptual and ideological impact of the art being displayed. Moreover, it seems to me that, confronted to this artwork, the visitor should question the possible co-optation by the museum of an institutional criticism. Thanks to this artwork, in order to avoid being accused of hypocrisy for putting on a large polluting exhibition about the environment. If we now take a different view, what does this work reveal about audit? First, if we consider the audit done by ILHEIN from a technical point of view, this work is an illustration of the law of diminishing returns and the need for the auditor to consider the cost of an audit as well as the level of certainty of the conclusion reached. It is also an illustration of the need for thresholds to set limits and gain an overall understanding. And it also illustrates the role of the experts who can and should be called upon by the auditor. I also think that these artworks leads us to consider the image of the auditor it conveys, that of a practitioner divided between soporific calculations and philosophical questions. In this diagram, ILHEIN identifies the ins and outs of an artwork. But how can they be measured? By what criteria do we evaluate the processes and manifestations of human culture? Finally, I strongly believe that this work inherently raises the question of what is the most important aspect of the audit for the auditee. Is it the act of submitting to an audit and thus demonstrating its social responsibility, or is it the result of the audit? This artwork shows that the symbolic value of the audit sometimes exceeds its practical value in society. I would now like to talk about the work Il s'est passé quelque chose, or Something Happened in English, created by the French artist Joséphine Kaplan in 2018. Joséphine Kaplan describes herself as an artist consultant and a provider of intellectual and graphic services. Since 2016, part of her work has been based on carrying out audits. However, as she explains, and I am translating her own words here from the original French, unlike a traditional audit, which is used to measure effectiveness or compliance with standards, or to assess work practices, my investigations have no objective to achieve. However, as a rule of conduct, I infer the working routine in order, perhaps, to maintain the distance required to reflect on oneself and on the socio-occupational structure in which it is integrated. Joséphine Kaplan first carried out audits in artistic contexts in France and Belgium. In 2018, she worked in an industrial context, carrying out an artistic audit of the German company Sigwerk, one of the leaders in the packaging printing ink sector at the company's Haute-Savoie site in France. This resulted in the work entitled Il s'est passé quelque chose, consisting of 7 pages of an audit report painted on the company's walls. Here, you can see 2 excerpts from the report. Before presenting this work in more detail, and in order for you to fully understand the artistic approach followed by Joséphine Kaplan, I think it is important to return first to the appearance in contemporary art of what could be termed service-providing art, which is characterized by the provision of services as an artistic practice, which corresponds to Joséphine Kaplan's approach. This specific artwork on the walls of the company is merely a consequence of this provision of services, as it is explained in the notice at the company's entrance. For those of you who do not read French, it is written, "The following report is a subjective finding recounting the experience of Sigwerk's employees between February and May 2018 in Annemasse, France. The document consists of 7 pages. It is to be read standing up while walking. The document was made public on Thursday, the 13th of December of 2018. This report, which constitutes an artwork in its own right, is nonetheless not the artwork. It is merely a trace, a memory of the artistic audit done by Joséphine Kaplan. Before going further, I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that the artist was careful to show the word objective just before subjective at the end of the first line, which she crossed out in order to emphasize the subjective nature of the finding presented in the report. In doing this, she differentiates her report from other audit reports drawn up in the customary way. Let's now discuss further what is the provision of services in contemporary art and the 3 different forms it takes. The first one is that of the artist calling upon a service provider. This is the case, for example, of Martin Le Chevalier, who called out on an audit firm in order to create the work audit that I described earlier. This is also the case for Julie Picard when she asked an audit firm to check her work Comptez mes jours. The second is that of the artist providing services for the museum. This is the case for Lucas ILHEIN when he was commissioned by Sydney's Contemporary Art Centre to carry out an environmental audit, as I described just now. The third form, which is what we are looking at here with the work of Joséphine Kaplan, is that of the artist who becomes a service provider, that is to say, who adopts the practices characterizing the service economy. These practices reflect the hegemony of tertiary activities in Western societies. The artist thus stresses the importance of the intangible in the economy. Service-providing artists, as Joséphine Kaplan, share a desire to highlight a gesture, a relationship. In other words, the concept takes precedence over any form and over production. There is therefore a break with the traditionalist view of art as necessarily having to take the form of an object intended to be exhibited in a gallery or museum. Service-providing artists are also motivated by a desire for social political engagement, which they express visibly or otherwise, contrary to the idea of the autonomy of art. In other words, their actions are as close as possible to reality. Finally, the production and consumption of the work are concomitant or temporarily very close. It is therefore a question of exposing someone to something rather than exhibiting something to someone. Given these clarifications, I now propose that we look in more detail at the work of Joséphine Kaplan. She first distributed a questionnaire entitled Bonjour to the company's employees by hand. You can see her doing it in this image. She's on the left with a cap. She's wearing a white gown with written on the back of it, J'agis comme une table de ping-pong. I act as a table tennis table, in English. This sentence is an affirmation of what she is doing, trying to engage in an exchange to react to ideas. Joséphine Kaplan then suggested a conversation game. Each participant had to spin a wheel, then take a question card based on the color shown and answer the question orally. The questions relate to work. For example, what do you think of multidisciplinary skills? They relate to society. For example, how can we slow down? And to the arts. For example, what do you like to look at? The third game set up by the artist is a writing game entitled What do you do for a living? Employees pick 3 wooden dominoes at random, from a bag and must use the text on the dominoes to make sentences in order to answer the question, what do you do for a living? With these 3 devices, Joséphine Kaplan places at the core of her artistic approach the feeling of the world of work and the intrinsic value of work. With what kind of mindset do we work? What is the meaning of work for an individual? In other words, she questions the symbolic and social representations of work with a subjective view and a voluntary mismatch. What Joséphine Kaplan offers is useless, subverting the values that prevail in the economic world while appropriating the utilitarian aim of the auditor's work. In other words, she questions what work is in an environment that cannot tolerate work being called into question. At the end of her audit, Joséphine Kaplan asked the company's employees to vote for their preference for the audit result from among 5 options. I want rugs, I want the whole report, I want posters, I do not want anything, I want everything. The employees voted for the whole report, entitled Il s'est passé quelque chose. The report is painted in the corridors of various company buildings. This choice shows that the relationship to the exhibition of something, and more generally, the symbolic value of artifact of art, remains important in society. But as I was explaining earlier, the report is not the experience. It just operates as a memory of it. Regarding audit, I believe that the work of Joséphine Kaplan is a source of reflection for auditors to rethink how to showcase their work by improving the presentation of audit information. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that auditors from the European Court of Auditors should start painting their reports on the walls of the audited organizations. But I do think that some alternative and maybe unexpected ways to present audit reports could be considered, inspired by artistic practices. I have already gone on too long, so I need to conclude quickly. I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation of contemporary works of art to illustrate the widespread presence of audit in contemporary art. Above all, I hope I have shown you how art can offer a different view of audit and how contemporary art offers an illustrative example of the ever-expanding scope of audit. Of course, by limiting myself to artworks relating to audit, I intentionally excluded works with no apparent link to audit, but in which the viewer can see a reference to audit. Depending on the context of its presentation, depending on the viewer, any work of art can become a source of reflection for the auditor. I clearly remember the first time I entered the court. After passing the security checks, I walked through the temporary exhibition by French contemporary artist Blaze, and I was very surprised because I did not expect this at all. I remember very well wondering whether this exhibition was an allegorical way of inviting visitors, such as myself, as well as those working at the court, to reflect on what audit is, a mixture of traditional and contemporary practices. And here stands, I think, the most important conclusion of my lecture. Chosen artworks, whether they are related to audit or not, can help to define for the court's staff as well as the visitors what is a court, what are the values the court is built on, and who are the people working for this important European institution. To close, I would like to sincerely thank the members of the European Court of Auditors connected today. It is a great honor for me. I also would like to thank the people from the staff of the court, and in particular those who have followed or are following the master program on audit of public organizations and policies, organized in partnership between the court and the University of Lorraine. All my thanks also to all the members of the Art Management Network of the European Union institutions for their presence. I would also like to thank those of you who have kindly accepted my personal invitation to attend this conference, whether you are from the French Association of Accounting Directors, l'Association des professionnels et directeurs comptables, the Company of Statutory Auditors of the Grand Est Region, la compagnie régionale des commissaires aux comptes de la région Grand Est, the French Institute of Audit and Internal Control, l'Institut français de l'audit et du contrôle interne, the University of Lorraine, or from the French Association of Accounting. I would also like to thank Mr. de la Fuente Garrigosa for organizing this conference and inviting me to present my thoughts on the presence of audit in contemporary art. I thank also the European Court of Auditors Training Department, and in particular Mrs. Ardelen, for their support and enthusiasm on the proposed topic, and I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Milionis once again for agreeing to introduce this lecture. Thank you also to my two kids, Louis Ferdinand and Gustave Marie, and my lovely wife, who are listening. This is the first time they have attempted one of my lectures, and I'm very proud of that. I love you. Finally, I would like to thank you all for your time and attention, and it will be my pleasure to answer any question you may have. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.